So welcome everybody to this meetup organized by System Change in Finland, in which we will speak about embedding system thinking into the work of an international development organization such as UNDP. My name is Arnaldo Pellini and I'm speaking from Tampere. I've been living here in Tampere for the last 3.5 years. And before moving to Finland, I've lived and worked for about 15 years in different countries in Southeast Asia, working international development on issues related to governance and education reforms. I work in Cambodia, Vietnam, the same office where our speaker is talking about today, the Philippines and Indonesia. And my recent work embeds element of system thinking because I work in international development project conducting political economy studies that inform design of projects and programs, as well as the design of monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems for adaptive and complex aware programs. The event today is organized by System Change Finland. Let me go to that slide. System Change Finland is an association which has been established in August last year, 2020, so is quite recent, and it was established by people who are brought together, colleagues who are brought together by this interest in system thinking, but particularly also in how system thinking can be applied to try to address, systemic and complex challenges in our societies today. And the purpose of the association, which has reached now 2,000 members in the Facebook group that is you see on this slide, is to promote the application of approaches that help people in organization and society understand and work with systems and complexity. The event of today is organized also in collaboration with Systems Innovation, which is an international e-learning and collaborative platform applying new ideas and methods for system innovation. So it's a collaboration also with System Innovation. A few words just to introduce the topic that Ida will discuss and share with us today. Just to give a bit some idea, maybe my personal also point of view with regard to the topic of today of embedding system thinking in international development and the work of UNDP. And, there has been now for quite some time, I guess, a bit of challenges for international development initiatives or in the sector to deal with complexity or complex problem. This is not because this organization and the work in international development doesn't address complex problems. Actually, it does most of the time, such bringing education to all children or reducing, maternal mortalities in countries and any other number of problems. These are very complex problems, but in international development, there has been a tendency always to try to minimize the uncertainty that addressing complex problems poses. In 2009 and 2010, I was working in UNDP in Vietnam, in Hanoi, and I remember something that at that time country economist for UNDP told me. He was a bit sarcastic when he said that, but he told me that development projects or programs never fail. So they always succeed, in a sense, in achieving the change or the outcomes that they are supposed or designed to achieve and meet. And I mean, he was a bit sarcastic, but it spoke to me to this tendency to try, when it comes to the implementation of a development project and program, to kind of guarantee in the design, in the planning, in the reporting, the results that will come. Something that has been there for quite a long time in the international development sector, but things, and has led to what you see here in this slide, a little bit to this single point solution. So ad hoc initiatives that maybe are not well interconnected to try to address specific problem, but maybe don't achieve a systemic change. Things are changing, and there has been, I would say, over the last 10 years, a bit of greater recognition about the complexity of addressing problems and more talking of experimentation, adaptive development, adaptive programming. So there is a process, ongoing process and discussion, which is about moving from this, a little bit, this single point solution, magic bullet, into initiatives that are more or better or well connected, so that system transformation becomes more likely, and so never sure. And and try to challenge a bit this linear thinking, which has existed and still exists in international development. And as I said, this is one slide, shows a little bit maybe what I'm thinking about the ongoing changes that are occurring in the sector, but I think it fits also with what Ida will share in her presentation. Now, a few words about Ida herself. Ida Uusikylä is the cross-unit innovator at UNDP in Vietnam. She has worked in the UNDP office in Hanoi for the past 2.5 year, and very much embedded in this process and system. Try to get, also for me being Italian, actually it's a slight trying to get to those those spaghetti of initiatives and interventions and program. Ida's background includes expertise in e-governance, emerging technologies, institutional reform, governance reform, and innovation, policy and complexity science. She has worked with the Government of Finland on foreign affairs and science, and with the European Commission in Finland on political affairs. She has also worked before joining UNDP as an independent consultant working on evaluation of international development initiative in the space of governance reforms. She holds a bachelor in political science from the University of Helsinki, and she has also a master in development management from the London School of Economics in the UK, and we will hear from her in a minute.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I think it's a real honor to be here on this platform to share about UNDP's work on embedding systems thinking. And I have to put a bit of a disclaimer that I'm working in the UNDP Viet Nam country office, so I can't speak for the whole organization. There's a lot of good work being done across the board in all the different countries. So this is basically highlighting the experience from Vietnam specifically. So today I'll be just briefly sharing to you about what we have been doing in terms of embedding systems thinking and how this kind of whole thinking kind of came about. So I'll be kind of focusing on 3 key areas, one of them being the Accelerator labs and the kind of paradigm shift in the ways of how we work, as kind of Arnaldo was nicely sharing before. And then secondly, about portfolio sense making, and then finally about how are we moving towards creating portfolios or designing portfolios. So this is kind of the general overview of what I'll be sharing about today. And of course, some of those, I could see some friends and colleagues online, this all might be very familiar to you already, but and this is basically the kind of back practice and implementation work that we are doing at the country office level. So that's the kind of perspective I'm speaking from. So firstly, a quick overview of the Accelerator Labs network. You might have heard about this network that's being developed. But essentially, it kind of started in 2019, and Vietnam country office was one of the first country offices in the first cohort of labs that we kind of started integrating this lab in the office, and I started then supporting and working on this. And this came from the point, a notion that that the challenges that we're seeing today are so complex and so interlinked and fast moving that our current efforts and initiatives are perhaps not best aligned to address these, or not addressing them fast enough. So as we have seen this year, it's been a really exceptional year with COVID, and we didn't see it coming, and what that kind of resulted in, and that's a good kind of example of how our current practices are not perhaps best aligned to deal with complexity and dealing with uncertainty. So this is why the labs were initially set up. So we're basically saying that effectively addressing these types of new challenges, they just don't require only new solutions, but new strategies for understanding these challenges as they unfold. It requires new approaches to identifying solutions, and it requires addressing not only the problem that we see in front of us, but the broader environment that created or led to the problem in the first place. So we call this the relevance gap. So we have here the kind of nice diagram that the organization uses to show where our current approaches are. Where are the challenges and fast-paced challenges that we're trying to address, and what's the gap in between? So UNDP is now trying to address this gap in terms of disrupting how the organization thinks, delivers, invests, and manages to basically perform better. We're trying to inject innovation into our organizational DNA, and with the labs in the core. And this is basically saying that we don't see the labs only as a separate siloed unit working and doing their own thing. Of course, every country office has a bit of a different approach, but at least in Vietnam, we've taken a very much from the beginning, a very kind of integrative role with the lab, trying to work with the projects, trying to work with colleagues, and integrating these approaches to our office. So now we have 92 labs around the world, which creates an enormous network of learning that we're kind of gathering insights, kind of what works and what doesn't, how are different labs addressing and learning through the experimentation and cycles that I'm going to present to you in a minute to address some of these really wicked challenges. So here is essentially kind of the core set of competencies or the kind of services that we're trying to bring, and also trying to build capacity for within our country offices and places, and with our government partners. And the first one is on collective intelligence, which to us means, keeping the finger on the pulse, understanding what's happening on the ground, what's kind of affecting the behaviors, how are people perceiving change and challenges, and then based on that, designing new forms of public accountability, and also what is happening in the future. We're trying to build new capabilities around foresight, about anticipating change, which kind of adds to this, and using new types of data. Then portfolios of experiments, designing and executing portfolios of tests. And this is something that as Arnaldo shared, is maybe not something that we are really used to be doing as part of our traditional projects, because when you do tests, there's always a notion of failure or something to adapt, and that's not maybe something that any organization is dealing very well with. So now we're kind of we have this mandate to test and try, and essentially in a portfolio way. So not, as Arnaldo said, not only a single point solution that this is a magic bullet that's going to solve the issue, but we have a portfolio of solutions and interventions that we're trying to test and learn from. So the next one is solutions mapping. So this is to branch out to discover solutions and workarounds in communities, for example. So basically, before we kind of were seen as kind of the solution provider in a way. We kind of said we have all the solutions to all these issues, but in fact, nobody has the solutions necessarily to all these. So we're co-creating the solutions, and we're also acknowledging that many communities already have solutions to these challenges that we just need to leverage and scale up. So we're taking that as a new kind of an offering for the lab to really tap into these existing solutions and learning more of what works. And finally, Sensemaking, which I'll be just sharing more with you just in a minute, but is to support the public sector to stay relevant in a complex and fast-paced environments, and also for us, similarly, to do that. So I'll just share that about that in a minute. So then what do the accelerator labs bring to the development sectors? Essentially, what we bring is radically accelerated learning, a greater breadth of solutions, and the ability to bridge to scale. So this is what the network is about. We're trying to accelerate learning about what works and what doesn't. So if you're to think, usually some people, when I talk about the accelerator labs, is that it's a startup accelerator or incubator, and that's a kind of another accelerator. That's true. But for us, it's about understanding what works and what doesn't in different contexts, because we can't just introduce same solutions for different contexts and expect them to work. So we're trying to learn quicker here, and this is basically how. So this is kind of the network in action. So we start from sensing, understanding what are the emerging challenges and opportunities in local contexts, and where do we need to focus. Exploring and better kind of understanding the challenge and looking at the solutions, what's out there, how are citizen already, or people on the ground already coping with these things, and then testing, going back to the portfolio, potential solutions, and then continuously kind of then iteratively repeating this cycle. So here is an example from Vietnam, what we have done. We have a team of 4 for our accelerator lab, and I myself work with the team. So here we've been mainly focusing on, and I'll be going this in the last section of the presentation as well, a bit more in depth of that we've been working and focusing on circular economy and the transition from linear to more circular economy specifically. And firstly, we started focusing on waste management. So here you can see on the right side, there is our experiment that we conducted together with the local authorities in Da Nang about waste sorting. And this is where we kind of build this lean experiment around and using behavioral insights. And these types of experiments have been done before in other contexts, and kind of nudging behaviors in terms of sorting behavior, especially in Da Nang, in selected localities, and using different types of bins and seeing what works and what doesn't. And this type of an initiative was then eventually adopted as part of the local government's policy design. So it kind of led into something a bit more concrete at the end of it, although it was a small experiment. And then on the left side, you can see there is our other kind of experiments utilizing collective intelligence and new types of data sources. One of the issues we're facing there is this kind of dual system in terms of informal, formal waste management. And here you can see the root of informal waste pickers that do the majority of the waste collection in this particular context. So to understand how they move, where do they collect the waste, how do they move there? So that's kind of our other part of the research that we've been doing, better to understand the system that we're trying to address. So that was a quick overview about the accelerator labs and some of the work that we've been doing in Vietnam. So now moving on to the portfolio Sensemaking. And this is essentially a kind of a capability, a tool to build organizational coherence and eventually to accelerate the impact of initiatives. So what is it about? So it's to learn rapidly and extract insights from the current activities to accelerate their effects and induce system transformation. So here you can see some of the photos from our 2019 portfolio Sensemaking. We organized a Sensemaking amongst some of the first country offices at UNDP. So it's an iterative process that creates actually an institutional capacity for renewal through structured conversations, being the portfolio sensemaking, about the scale, diversity, impact, and coherence across all our current activities. So in our case, projects. So essentially it creates intelligence about the existing interventions and actionable intelligence that structures decision-making and commitments to impactful actions in the future. So that's just kind of the baseline of how we see the sense-making and how our protocol has been designed to support us in terms of adopting these types of new capabilities and really kind of working in complex environments and creating more impactful portfolios. So just a quick overview, because sometimes concepts can be difficult to, or we put different meanings to different words. So it's often useful to kind of lay out what we mean by portfolio, what we mean by sense making. So I'll just give you a quick overview. This protocol that we call it, Portfolio Sense Making Protocol, was developed together with Cora Foundation. So our regional office in Bangkok has been working with them, and then we've been implementing it at the country office level. So to us, a portfolio is a learning and sense-making system that can be leveraged to accelerate effects and induce system transformations. So emphasis for us is on the learning and making sense of what is it that our current interventions are about. So here, then following that, a kind of a sense-making part is an activity, a process that extracts insights, induces learning, and creates a meaning from an experience. So again, it's an emphasis in a way on the experience, and I'm going to go to that in a minute of what do we mean by that and how do we integrate that as part of the organization's core. Again, here you can see some portfolio sense-making in action. So how does it look like? It's really about creating that space, and it's an intensive 3-day event of bringing together those that are part of that organization. And I don't know about other organizations in a way, but for many and for us included, it's also, it takes time, and these types of reflection moments are really important. And when you have everyone in the same room, it creates this kind of a dynamic and discussion and kind of shared understanding of who we are, what are we about, what are we wanting to achieve, what is it that we are already doing, and how can we kind of accelerate the impact that we want to see. So just here quickly, the overall process, that what we saw there in photos. It's really to establish first, the whole process begins by establishing identity. So who are you? What is it? What's your mandate? What is the identity that you're kind of putting into this process? And then what is the intent? And what is it that you want to achieve? Why that moves identity to take action? So what is the reason? And basically the information here comes from the sense-making process, where portfolio insights are extracted and possible network effects that could accelerate impact are identified. So here you can see the projects. So for us, that's projects. For other organizations could be something else that you want to make sense of, but that's our reference point. And then that generates intelligence. And again, emphasis on the fact that it's a highly socialized experience, and kind of the result is also based on what do you put in the sense-making process? What is it that you're trying to make sense of? What is the selection of the projects, for, in our instance, that you want to understand, and that the coherence you're trying to understand? So just a quick overview of the process of how it goes is that, first of all, with the project sharing, so the insight extraction process in general, here you can see on the photo, it moves participants iteratively from a dance floor, which is for us the selection of the individual projects, to the balcony of which is to us the portfolio perspective throughout the sense making. And this is a really key part of that sense making process, that kind of a different viewpoint to the kind of content that you're trying to review. So on the dance floor, the project presenters communicate their project strategically in rounds. So we are using different types of project sheets. So oftentimes when you give, in our case, for example, a project manager the floor free to talk about his or her baby, it can go on forever because everyone's so excited about their projects. So we're basically giving them a very strict frame of what they have to share about the project, what is the key. So really kind of being a bit more strategic about what to share and how, in terms of, for example, why is it that we're doing this? Why at this point in time is this project important? And it's often even as an individual process for project officers to think about why am I doing what I'm doing? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? And then thinking with what is it? What are the activities that I'm doing? And it's also even before the sense making a kind of an individual reflection of one's work and how that work translates into impact. So that's kind of the pre-side of the sense-making process in itself, but these kind of questions come very immediate in the portfolio sense-making context. And then at the same time, your colleagues are sitting there in the circle asking you questions about more in-depth questions about your project that create a better understanding for everyone that's not directly involved. And at the same time, while this process is going on, we have what we call they're balcony listeners or mappers, more friendly, and they basically listen to all this sharing through different frames. So these frames are predefined or pre-decided, and one can be, for example, connectivity, how these different projects connect to each other. One could be of values. What are the different values coming out from these different projects? What is what is being said? How do we see how our values guide our work? One could be, for example, scale. What is the scale effect that individual projects are aiming to achieve? Is it like a local scale effect? Is it a national scale effect? Is it cross-border effect? And mapping these as the kind of sharing goes, and these are kind of shared back to the project officers or to the presenters all the time. And then basically after this kind of a round, we move on to kind of identifying patterns in what we have seen from this sharing and from these types of frames that come about. What is it that is emerging? What's the insights that we're trying to get from this? And then we move on in the process of kind of going back to detail, back to bigger picture, and then eventually creating actionable intelligence based on what do we need to accelerate in the portfolio that we're looking at there to increase impact. And these results from each of the portfolio sense makings are, of course, very, very different and very, very context specific. So then this type of sense making is iterative. So it's good to have, of course, as a one-off exercise, but what it's really designed for is to be iterative, because complex world is constantly emerging. So we need that kind of a reflection all the time to make sure that what we're doing is creating the impact that we want to see. So here is the bigger kind of a learning cycle, as we call it, in terms of how do we see that happening in the kind of a bigger scale. So first we have the scanning of the environment. What does the pulse of the outside world feel like, for example, really understanding, and that's a bit of the sensing that I mentioned before for the Accelerator lab, what's happening, and then reflecting our identity. Who are we? What is our role in a context? That's a very important question of what is it who we are, what is our mandate, what do we want to achieve? And then evaluating the cohesion. So what does our portfolio look like? Why these projects at this time? And also when we take this to the kind of next step, you are trying to understand how these projects, how these interventions interlink with other interventions in this space, because of course UNDP is doing a lot. but so is everyone else. So we're still a drop in the ocean. But once we start understanding what's already happening, if we're trying to, for example, address waste management, what interventions are already in place? How can we create that kind of a learning mechanism between our interventions and their interventions? How can we make sure that what we're doing is coherent? So those are the questions we're trying to ask. And then setting direction. What do we need to learn? What are we not learning fast enough? Is there something that we're not understanding? Some kind of, and here's almost like a bit of the part of anticipation, foresighting, that we're trying to also build our capabilities in. And then designing portfolios of experiments. Where can we intervene, and where should we, place our bets, giving this everything that we know now? What else is there that needs an intervention, and the portfolio of tests of what works to address that issue. And then finally, putting knowledge into action, and what kind of implications does this have, what we've learned, and where are our next steps. So that's kind of the bigger learning cycle that we see UNDP to move towards, and also have this type of thinking iteratively throughout our experience. So that's my first sharing on our work with how we came about, in terms of the Accelerator Labs network. How did this start? The thinking start with embedding systems thinking, and the transition of understanding that the way we work is not perhaps fit to addressing the 21st century challenges we're trying to solve. And then how do we make sense of our internal actions and the kind of housekeeping of our own work? So that's my first sharing. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll be sharing more about the portfolio design in the next session. Yeah, so thanks everyone. We're just chatting in the breakout room how we really value this type of a platform that's being created. I think it's enormously helpful, and of course I can't hear as much from you guys as you're hearing from me, but it's really really great. I'm really grateful for being part of those discussions and getting to know these different perspectives. We have so many people from different backgrounds on this platform and here today. So I think it's really, really fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to the final discussions and hearing from you, because it's such what we discussed and what actually has been a topic of discussion in our office as well, is that systems thinking sometimes for organizations like ours that are we're not researchers, we're not like, we're coming from a very different perspective of implementing projects to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And sometimes there's a bit of an exhaustion on innovation in this vocabulary. So, we shouldn't be using these terms just meaning everything, because then they won't mean anything in the end. So it was a good chat we had, and I hope to get back to that in the last part. But so I'll just quickly share before that, continuing from where I left with the Sensemaking, about portfolio design. And this comes again back, from my previous, from the previous discussion about how do we move away from a single point project solutions to complex, and emphasizing here complex development challenges, to a portfolio of solutions, because we understand that you can't solve, complex challenges like COVID or unemployment or climate change with only one solution. So how do we approach this? And if we are to effectively address these issues, where do we go next? And how do we adapt, and how do we learn as an organization to be more effective in terms of addressing these issues? So let's see. Yep, my computer froze for a moment, but here I'll just quickly give you a bit of an overview, because what I'm sharing about is a case studies, a series actually from our country office from Vietnam, trying to address the issue of moving away from a linear economy towards more of a circular economy, trying to kind of basically change the current economic model or our system. And I just tapped upon it before on the waste management side, but it's obviously a very, very complex issue, not only looking at the downstream side, but also the upstream side. So the background of it is that that Vietnam has experienced really an enormously rapid economic growth of 6% of growth every year. But on the other hand, even though this growth has been actually fairly inclusive, so a multiple of or the whole society has benefited from it relatively well, but it's come with a high cost for the environment. So this includes, increased consumption, degradation of natural resources, and environmental pollution. And in fact, Vietnam is on track to becoming a major GHG emitter by 2030. And at this time, when major economies are taking stepped up actions, of course, Vietnam is doing that too, but perhaps slower. So Vietnam is also being ranked at the fourth in the world for plastic waste, with 1.83 million tons discharged to the ocean every year. So it's another major issue that we're challenging, and a very complex, so to speak, issue in itself. And so the current policy framework for circular economy is still very fragmented in Vietnam, although there's been a lot of work being done there, and UNDP has been supporting Vietnam on the policy side as well. For example, on the new renewed law on environmental protection, and others, where circular economy has been introduced as a concept, because it's not something that's perhaps very familiar to them before. So then, on the other hand, what I shared before, the Accelerator Lab's work has been focusing on Da Nang. So here are some numbers from Da Nang outlining some of the how kind of a critical of an issue we're talking about. So there's 1,100 tons of waste generated every day, and 90% of this goes to the landfill. And why we're doing is that addressing this issue right now for us is that the landfill in Da Nang is full. It cannot function anymore unless something is being done. So this is what kind of brings urgency to this issue. And often when we try and advance these issues in different contexts, this kind of brings the political need and intent to our work as well, because it's so urgent. So what we did in Da Nang to address this, you already saw some of the experimentation work that we did and the mapping of the informal waste workers' routes to better understand these different systems that are essentially part of the same waste management model there. But we organized a systemic design workshop, and this was together with Alberta Collab, which is a government think tank based in Alberta, Canada. So we worked with them. We created this kind of a space for very diverse stakeholders to come together to dive deeper into the system. So we visualized complexity from multiple perspectives, and we shared and created shared frames for reference and surfaced core assumptions that we have, and we found opportunities by framing the challenge. And this is kind of really the whole work acknowledge the importance of human stories and experience within the system. And this was a very valuable experience for everyone that was participating. We had government officials, we had basically everyone that was part of the waste management system in Da Nang. Businesses, citizen, we have Urenco, which is a waste collection company, etc. And basically we use different ways of looking at the challenges. We, for example, introduced Lego, bit of an innovation thing, but really to understand and kind of switch on the creative side of everyone participating, because I don't know, in my experience, in many contexts, for example, bureaucrats or government officials have kind of, and pretty much everyone has this kind of a very linear way of thinking about these things. But when we introduce, for example, Legos into this, how do we kind of design the current system and visualize it in that sense, it creates new types of narratives around it. So it was very, very eye-opening for us. So then we use this Iceberg model, which to many of you might be very, very familiar. So we looked at the patterns and the trends. We looked at the underlying structures of the issue, and we looked at the mental models that are really underlying the whole thing. So basically things like it's the government's job to deal with the issue. People pay to see the results, technology will fix it. And separation at source is a pain, these types of things. So, and then we moved on there to create first attempts of portfolio design, because we gathered all this intelligence. We had these, different perspectives, and because we tried to really understand how does the current system look like now? How do we want it to look like? What's the preferred state of the system? Where do we want to take it to? Because every time you change a system, when it's status quo, somebody's going to lose, somebody's going to gain. We pictured those kind of transitions as to what happens to, for example, informal waste workers that are outside of the formal system. What happens to their income? Are they still relevant in that waste management system as it is then? What are the different pathways to the preferred state? And often we also add to this, what is the preferred state in that context? These can be very different depending on different, countries, different cities, municipalities. So what is it that they see how it should be working and what is not working? So to have this space for this type of reflection. So for us, the kind of the underscoring questions for this work were, you can see there, so how can we design a dynamic portfolio that evolves with local community and ownership? And this is something that we really want to emphasize, because for any kind of solutions or a portfolio of solutions experiments to be sustainable, we need to have the local ownership. How to ensure coherence and complementarity of our interventions with other actors in the ecosystem. This is what I was kind of speaking about before in a way as well, like how do our interventions, for example, ours and World Banks and ADBs and UNICEF's, UNIDO's, others, Vietnam governments and businesses' interventions in this space, how do they align and how do they complement each other? And of course, in a complex system, these interactions and relationships are, continuously evolving. So nothing is stable. So that's why also we need to create this kind of a dynamic portfolio that adapts. And then how can we leverage resource and relationships from different teams? And this is a bit of maybe a more internal UNDP a thing for the Accelerator Lab as well, when we think of how do we leverage existing knowledge and capabilities, skills, resources to support this work. So then here you can see the kind of portfolio logic we created. Here you can see one of the portfolios, which is on the compliance portfolio. And this comes from of course, the recognition, as I was speaking before, that there's no single point solutions to address such, an enormously complex challenge that's constantly evolving. So the first portfolio we designed was on the current system, the compliance side, because there's, a lot of challenges as it is, because, for example, there is existing regulations, rules, rules that people and businesses and everyone has to abide by, but there is very little enforcement sometimes of these rules and regulations. So so how do we kind of get this compliant behavior in place and create the incentive and accountability mechanisms there? And then we have this more of a transformational portfolio on the green consumption that there is testing in terms of what incentivizes consumption actors to be more mindful of their consumption habits and reducing the waste that actually is even generated. So Finland and for example, other Nordic countries and European countries, Germany, others are very advanced in this thinking. And there's different actually approaches to how to approach this. But these things sometimes, and in Vietnam, for example, are still very nascent as challenges or issues. So here we can see the overview of the kind of the portfolio that was created with the dominant system and the emergent system that you can see coming with these new types of interventions. And that then kind of the transition from the dominant system to the emergent system that was designed. So this is kind of our way of thinking, because as I said, it's an iterative process. So how we started this whole thing, apart from the Da Nang systemic design workshop, we also had ethnographic research. And what we want to, for our work in Vietnam has been very important from the beginning is that kind of human aspect of it. You know, essentially it's about human relationships and dynamics and behavior. So we have been taking this kind of as a baseline and as a kind of a starting point for our efforts to understand how the system works and how the interventions are designed. So we did ethnographic research. We discussed with the informal way speakers. We discussed with everyone outside of the workshop as well. Observed what are the dynamics at play, and then we redesigned, reimagined how the system can look like, in a more sustainable and circular way, and then brainstorm possible initiatives and interventions in the space. And then we created the portfolio combining this intelligence and validated those ideas back with the communities that we started the discussions with, and articulated the portfolio logic, and then re-engaged again with the local community. So that's kind of, and then that's like a cycle in a way that we want to do in our work. And how do we make sure that we validate what we're doing constantly with those that are experiencing experiencing those challenges that we're talking about. So then to deepen this work on portfolio design, that was kind of the early design on waste management in Da Nang, but to really embed this as a capability in the office, because it's not something that we're necessarily learned we're used to be doing, and how do we create portfolios that learn from each other? Different interventions are continuously learning from each other. It's not something that the very linearistically designed traditional projects are necessarily doing. Although I'm not saying that they need to be replaced, but they should be maybe perhaps in the future to combine and see what they can learn from this type of work. If this is useful for projects and in what ways. And of course, what we discussed in the breakout rooms as well is that different problems have very different approaches. So not everything is a complex challenge. So, it's not like works for every single challenge that we're looking at. But here, what we want to do with deepening our work is to build the muscle for our country office to see the systems, make sense of the rapidly changing realities, combine existing data with a range of qualitative insights. So what we've done as well is to do interviews to discuss with those that are experiencing the challenges, but also those that are substance experts at the challenges, and to understand the dynamics. And then exploring different strategies for engaging with colleagues, both to leverage wider team of colleagues and as a sense-making network, and identify entry points across existing portfolios or existing projects that we already have. And this is, I think, something very interesting that's a passion of mine, is this question of organizational learning, of how, if we are to say this is a capability that we need as an organization to function in the complex world and to address some of the complex challenges, then what does it require? And we had really interesting discussions in the breakout rooms, but how do we make our colleagues to learn and change and adapt, and not even change everything, but something, or having this curiosity in the organization of trying and testing new things aside their normal work. And everyone's working in a very intense time constraint all the time. And I'm sure that's familiar for you for a lot of different areas. So this is what we did. We are in the very beginning with this work. We're working with Snow Cone and Haystack, one company, to introduce this approach to our office, and building this organizational capacity. So as said, we interviewed different stakeholders, and I think this insight, we generated a lot of insights out of these interviews about the challenges that we're trying to look. And here we're really focusing on circular economy and the question around micro, small, and medium enterprises transitioning to circular economy in Vietnam. because we have an issue that many of the companies and industries are, for example, using very outdated technologies. There's a low capacity, low knowledge level. So there's a lot of kind of bottlenecks in terms of changing business models to be more circular. So for example, here is just getting some insights from these people that you don't get from the news or you don't get from, you know, traditional ways. So we, for example, an insight of one of my favorites, that there is a rising concern over the culture of short-term profit. Increasingly, entrepreneurial success is being seen as big, flashy, and fast money. Ugh, unicorns, so sick of it. I have a whole generation of youngsters who think they can make $1 billion next day. So I'm sure this kind of a quote could be actually applied to many other countries, but it's something that we're seeing in Vietnam. And that, you know, when we are to introduce these types of more sustainable economic trajectories, we need to understand. But going back to the organizational learning, for us, because what we're trying to promote is to better understand the underlying issues of the challenges we're trying to address. So previously, UNDP kind of and many organizations, due to a very big time constraint, is to here is a solution, a quick fix to these issues as discussed, but like what is it to really understand where these issues are coming from? So we're trying to introduce also the systems approach in the organization. So we've been trying to think kind of what sparks that interest. How do you approach colleagues that are really busy? Because it's essentially seeing a bit as annoying sometimes, it's this kind of a, don't you see I'm busy, I don't have time to learn. But it's a question about how do we move away from a doing organization to a learning organization, to me, and how do we start asking new questions about what we're doing. So we have identified that in our office, for example, what works sometimes is a fun quiz, because everyone's so busy they could do have a little break of in a form of a quiz with a nice prize, for example. That kind of sparks this, okay, well, it's fun, at least at least it's fun, and at least I can maybe win something as a bonus. So to introduce, for example, we had a question of what is a system? How do you understand a system when we talk about it? Because oftentimes from an innovation team's perspective, we think that these things are kind of obvious to everyone. Of course, you know what a system is, or of course, you know what, collective intelligence is, but it's really not. And it's kind of, it takes a lot to understand how the rest of the office works and thinks, to then make your own message effective and to induce that learning in the organization. So we kind of try to also check this pulse of what is the current situation, what are the current boundaries to learning and to integrating these approaches in the first place. So we also did this 3 whys exercise of trying to ask new types of questions around why, to start with changing the way we kind of ask questions and think. So that's some of the internal side in terms of how do we engage, how do we integrate. And actually the Accelerator labs for us have been from the beginning, as I said, very much an integrated approach. So we use it even as an approach. And when we design new projects, we do tend to integrate the Accelerator lab thinking with collective intelligent portfolio design as much as we can, to kind of meet the, to the existing projects or to new projects. And we're finding a lot of resonance there. So then finally, and this is the last thing before my summary, is that last thing what we're trying to do is to think about the role of capital in this transition. And this is maybe some of you that are really in the scene and are familiar with Climate Kick, which is European, under European Commission, think tank on climate questions. They have developed this theory around systemic investment. So this is something that resonated very well, and that actually fits really well of our other work, where we're trying to design a portfolio to address the transition to circular economy, but then capital plays a very, very, very important role in that transition. So basically, the question is, how might we create a mission-led portfolio-based systems intervention approach to engage different levers of change relevant to Vietnam's circular economy transition? So we need essentially new types of dialogues on systemic investing, with different partners. We need a consortium of challenge owners that want to commit to this task, and we need to initially raise awareness about systemic investing, because what we're witnessing right now with Vietnam as a middle-income country is that we're in a position of constantly reducing ODA. We're seeing a very big change in the investment frameworks and the financing frameworks for SDGs, and we're trying to see, but at the same time there's a lot of capital inflow from outside, and so what we're trying to see is how can we leverage existing resources that are essentially all very much directed to this kind of a bigger area of circular economy from different approaches. How can we leverage all this existing capital towards the same intent, and how do we then nest that within the broader framework of a portfolio that tries to address this change from different perspectives? So here you can see some kind of a picture outlining the intent, which then would be a transition to circular economy, and then you need these different kind of subsystems to be aligned, to be geared towards that challenge, and then you need the kind of a strategic portfolio around investment of different types, insurance, venture capital, crypto, maybe infrastructure, green bonds, perhaps different types of instruments there to be geared towards to addressing the same challenge, the question around blended financing. So these are things that we're also now trying to uncover this year in terms of in transitioning to circular economy. So finally, the key takeaways, because I do want to hear from all of you and I want to kickstart that discussion because it's a great platform and there's a lot of great minds online, is that, so what are the challenges? And this is again from UNDP Viet Nam's perspective, from our team's perspective, implementing and integrating systems change approaches in our context, is that for us, from our observations, it's quite difficult because it requires emergent design. And I don't know if this is something that you have found, but it's kind of this constant design, redesign, adaptation that is required to be actually keep up with the change realities around us. And our current structures and instruments and mechanics are not aligned with this. So we're trying to kind of we find it is difficult to retrofit to an existing kind of structure. And then wicked problems such as waste is hard to intervene due to lack of trust and collaboration between actors. So we found that low trust environments make transaction cost higher and limit possibilities. So building trust again, it takes time. And so all of these interventions, all this kind of systems change work, of course, takes time because there is this trust that needs to be built between actors and stakeholders that are a part of the same portfolio. And how do you do that in different contexts is, of course, very different and is dependent on the existing, power dynamics. Somebody is going to win, somebody's going to lose. And those are the things that you need to manage, and that makes the kind of implementation part of these theories very difficult. And then, of course, as said, juggling between long-term vision of systems change and short-term solutionism is that, of course, everyone wants to see results. So that's the tough task, because systems change takes time, and changing these things, thinking change time. So it's slow. So you need to balance that. And what we have found as well is that often important decisions, and this is something that many people have been talking about before us as well, is that important decisions are often made informally. So when if you're in a position where you're trying to integrate new thinking or new types of decisions or new types of approaches, it's not what we have found. It's not, often in the meeting rooms that change happens, but it's often through connections, often through informal discussions. So that kind of emphasizes the network of importance as part of eliciting this change. So then finally, some of the insights is that know your entry points and gatekeepers, be strategic with when you engage with whom. People with official mandate are not always necessarily open to divergent language, for example. Have flexible plans that tailor the language to different stakeholders. And this is, again, you know, you can't create change if people don't understand what you're saying. So you need to bring this to people. You need to kind of use their language to get your message across, especially in development. That's something that we've found very important, and also within our country office when we try and embed these approaches. And then create a playground platform that brings people together and have a different kind of relationship and dynamic. This is what we did in Da Nang, creating that space, and also what portfolio Sensemaking does. It creates the space for people to reflect, to think, imagine together without the fear of, you know, well, these are, of course, these fear questions are part of the power dynamic questions, which needs to be taken into account in the design of these sessions. Is a very important part. But creating these spaces is very important. And finally, local ownership of the portfolio is crucial for implementation and long-term sustainability, and validating those insights and assumptions with those that are experiencing the challenges. So that's the final one that we found, that it's this human capital and local ownership of this work and portfolios is very important. So that's from me. Thank you very much for listening. I know it was a bit too long slots for me, but if you want to reach me or ask any questions after this session, here are my contact info. Otherwise, very much looking forward to the discussions and hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Great. So thanks, Arnaldo. Thanks, Ida, for the excellent presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion we'll be having soon. But before that, and before we stop the YouTube stream, I'm going to say a few words about Systems Change Finland. Arnaldo already in the beginning, he was speaking about Systems Change Finland and what we do, and this is the part about how you can join us. So we have a big community on Facebook. We just went over 2,000 members there. You can also find us on Twitter. And we also have a Slack channel for those who want to be more engaged in what we do and maybe plan events or have more chats with us. And the other link I'd like to share is systemsinnovation.io. There are global partners in taking systems change forward in the world. Whereas we are focused mostly on Finland, Systems Innovation tries to start hubs in in a lot of different countries, and it's a good community that also has a Slack channel that you can join if you want to follow that a bit more. And Systems Change Finland, it's an NGO. So if you want to join Systems Change Finland and become a member, you can do it at systemschange.fi/membership. You can also find all our different links on that webpage. So thanks everybody for participating today, especially the YouTube watchers and everybody who wants to continue with the Q&A and the general discussion. Let's do that next. Thanks.